We are, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to this launch, which was inspired by Cara, who suggested that we have a formal launch for the book, the Philosophy as Practice in the Ecological Emergency, an exploration of urgent matters. So we're not all here. Not everybody who contributed to the book is here by any means, but we've managed to get a few of us together, and that's fantastic. And many of us haven't met before, so it's really nice to see people who I have spoken to virtually, like Kent, quite extensively, but never met before. I'm going to begin by lighting a candle, because for me, the idea of philosophy as a practice is the idea that we are working to experience realization, awareness, while we're acting through every action. And that was really the inspiration for this book. It was part of what I'd written about in my thesis, and I had been asked to edit a book by a different publisher, and then went to Palgrave. Went to a few publishers and got a positive response from Palgrave to the idea that we present a sort of tapestried approach with different perspectives that didn't necessarily agree, but would have a general approach to the question of how we respond to climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, and also those other fragmentations within human systems that are happening increasingly. Certainly here in the Canary Islands, there is mass migration, and it is creating enormous tension. So we see these fragmentations in human systems, and we see it in individuals as well. So how do we respond to that? Well, the book is a multiple faceted approach to this question, and I think it gives very interesting answers, and also very interesting questions raised about what we are, who we think we are, and how we fit into systems. I think that's all I'm going to say to begin with, and I'm going to hand over now to Jason, who will introduce himself, I hope, and also talk a bit about his contribution to the book and how he decided on that approach. Jason, you're very welcome, and thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Lucy, and it really is an honor to be here with everyone. I'm Jason Worth. I'm professor of philosophy at Seattle University in faraway, beautiful city of Seattle, in the mountains and waters. I'm chair of the department. I also know Lucy's work well because I had the distinctive pleasure some time ago of being on her dissertation committee. So that's how I know her, and that's how I know her work. And that's also one of the reasons why I admire her work so much. Another thing that is not incidentally true about me, I'm an ordained priest in the Soto Zen tradition. And I think Soto Zen is a deep systemic practice of self. By that, I mean also Soto Zen is not some philosophy, some set of ideas that I just append to my work and say, well, look, my bag of conceptual tricks is even bigger because I have some Zen tricks in there. Zen is a practice. It's not about believing, but it's about clearing your mind and getting out of the way of the world. And I think that's something that's really needed these days. So I'll take that as an opening to my little piece. I'll just begin by just reflecting on something that you all know just as well as I do. 2023, climactically, wow. It blew away all but the most hardened climate scientists. We all knew it was bad. We all knew it was going to be bad, and it's far worse yet again um, than most people expected. And the United Nations has told us repeatedly that we're going to have to make a change as a species on a scale that has never been done in the entire history of our species. And, we'll start by doing that by having climate summits in oil producing countries, and that should be the right direction. Oh, yeah, okay. It's going to be hard. We've never done it before. It's not clear that we can do it, but it's clear to me that we're not going to do it simply by producing um, this or that great argument. We could look very clearly at our prospects, have a very clear, rational appreciation of what we're up against, and we're still helpless. And that's true also of philosophy. Philosophy is going to have to dig deeper into its bag of powers and see what it can value add to its traditional powers. I'm not saying it should stop doing what it's been doing, but it's also going to have to do some other things in addition to clever, clear-minded argumentation. Um, this is what Thomas Berry, a fellow American, said before he died. He called this the great work, and that is the challenge of our time. And the great work for Thomas Berry was not to run out and have some engineering solution to the problem, because the problem is ourselves. We always talk about saving the earth, but saving it from whom? Well, saving it from ourselves. Why do we always put the emphasis on the earth when in analyzing what the problem is, we already announced the problem, which is ourselves? And that's the great work. At a historically unprecedented level, we are called forward to rethink who we are as a species. What are the prospects of us being successful? I don't know. The rational side of me says they can't be great. The Zen side of me says, but of course, this is the great work. We'll do it whether or not we succeed. Is what we have to do. And that's a little bit also behind my piece, because the great work includes Lucy's very admirable work on systems. My own work is also very much in that direction. And I might just put it kind of poetically, the great work includes the demand that we learn to think like a planet. Not what is the planet to me? The question can't simply, what can I do? As if we're called forward to some heroic argumentation or some heroic political acts. They won't be enough. They'll be too isolated. We have to think systemically, which means we also have to come to understand the great work as the way in which we think more deeply and more powerfully, with greater courage, but with less ego, about our place in those earth systems. It's their health that makes us possible. It's not us that makes them possible. That's part of the great work, is turning that upside down to get it right side up. So I'm going to read just 2 paragraphs from my little piece right here. And really, part of my motivation for this piece is all the different times I've given talks in the past, and some very anxious, very stressed out philosopher, and it's always a philosopher who comes up to me and says, should we just be working on policy? And of course, the answer is, of course, we should be working on policy, but we already have tons of great policy ideas. I don't think we need to keep revisiting them. I mean, if we just did half of what we know what to do, we'd be in a totally different situation. Problem is deeper than just more policy. And by the way, philosophers have no purchase on policy. I mean, they can make their own 2 cents contribution, but everyone else is working on that too. The political scientists, the environmentalists, the environmental scientists, they're all working on that. But philosophy, I think, has to dig deeper and really understand what it can bring to these conversations from the perspective systemic in nature, but unprecedented in demand, to the great work that we have to do in order to even avail ourselves of what we know we should do. So here's my little 2 paragraphs in which I discuss this in relationship to our field. We do not have to disclaim philosophy's current practices in order to reclaim some of its traditional possibilities and to assess the dangers of relegating philosophy exclusively to academic knowledge production. Attentiveness to some of its once traditional activities, however, allows us to appreciate that the ecological emergency is not just a new topic for philosophy, a new topic to process according to our settled methods. It is also an invitation to reassess the powers of philosophy. And philosophy has the great work as a deep systemic activity by which we have practices to learn to think also like a planet, not just like academics. The practice of philosophy is in this context an opening to philosophy as a practice of human living. This can be distinguished from the study of ethics as a philosophical discipline. First of all, ethical concepts do not in themselves somehow make us ethical. No ethical person asks if they should be ethical, but rather how to be ethical. The formal study of ethics assists those already inclined or dedicated to weighing their actions. We are all policymakers. We could argue about policy. The problem is, few of us are policymakers, and most of us persist catastrophically in a world without the great work. It is hard to imagine that reading Aristotle will give the executioner second thoughts about their vocation, or that a legal defense of torture, such as the ones provided by the George W. Bush administration, would convince serious students of ethics that this represents a serious advance. There are many difficult questions that the formal study of ethics helps us better resolve, and this endows it with vast value, but it also speaks to the fragility of the enterprise. The relentless marketing of fossil fuels is not the result of a failure to understand basic climate science. Bringing such fuels to the market, by the way, requires great technological expertise, any more so than it is an inability to understand basic ethical considerations, almost all of which would judge the burning of fossil fuels with their ruinous externalities to be ethical failings. The failing does not lie with ethics itself, but in the constitutive inability to be moved by its fruits. And it's this constitutive inability that calls me to practice. And those are where my thoughts are. Of course, you can imagine how excited I was when Lucy invited me to be part of a project of philosophy as practice in the ecological emergency. That is the great work. And my little piece was my 2 cents in that direction, to join you in thinking the planetary systems that we already are. So thank you very much, and I'm so happy to have been here.
Thank you very much indeed, Jason. That was fantastic, as usual. I think I'm not going to make commentary at this stage. And so if people do have questions for Jason, if they could put them in the chat, then we can address them as far as possible without Jason here at the end. I'm going to invite Brendan George now, if he would. And I don't know, Kent, if you can make Brendan a co-host, if you can see where he is and make him a co-host. I'm going to invite Brendan to say hello and perhaps to say a few words if he'd like to. Brendan is the commissioning editor who kindly accepted this project as a viable exercise in exploring what was going on, and has been with the project since the beginning. So if Brendan, you would be very kind when you have said anything else that you want to say, if you would be very kind and launch the book. I'm sure you are more familiar than I am with how to launch a book, so I know it's a bit early in proceedings to do so, but because you can only stay for a short period, I thought we might we might use this opportunity to let you say a few words and launch the book formally, and then everybody else can give their short 3 to 4 minute introduction. So I will, if I can, hand over to Brendan now, and if Kent can spotlight Brendan.
Hello, everybody. So I'm, as Lucy has kindly said, I'm Brendan George. I'm the publisher for philosophy at Palgrave Macmillan. Palgrave Macmillan is an imprint of Springer Nature. Lucy suggests that I know how to launch a book. I don't have a bottle of champagne with me. I don't quite know whether it's the same as launching a ship. I don't actually go to that many book launches, to be frank. And the ones I do go to, generally, I think the launch is just the meeting. But I will try to say something which formally launches the book. As I make my other comments, I will be, at the back of my mind, be thinking about exactly how I might do that. If anyone has any suggestions, please put them in the chat box. Anyway, as I say, I am the publisher. The book was published, as you're all aware, I'm sure, in March 23, and I'm very, very pleased to say that we have had 1,778 downloads. It is actually quite a nice thing ecologically to say that scholarly publishing has moved from distributing print books, or at least Springer Nature has. You can, of course, still get the book in print, but the vast majority of our sales now are through the library system, and we distribute our books electronically at the click of a button, so that we do not put loads and loads of books on planes or on boats all over the world. And in this, for your book, the print sales are nominal. I won't actually say what they are, but the print sales are nominal, and that is by intent. The main way that we now sell our books is through the library systems, and it is once the library has acquired a book, it is then free for all the scholars and students at universities worldwide to download the book to any device. So that is exactly what we have done in this case. And as I say, today, the download figures, which you can all track through the Springer link, go to the product page, and you'll see on the product page the title Accesses, and Accesses are downloads, and you can see in real time the downloads creeping up as more people all over the world download this book. I would also mention that this book was published as part of the Sustainable Development Goals series, which is a flagship Springer Nature series. Both Springer imprint and Palgrave imprint feeds books into that series. And well, I'm sure you're all quite interested in this topic. So if you wish to explore, there are a lot of books in that series. And as I say, if your university subscribes to the Springer Nature collections, then you too will be able to download books in that series for free through your university libraries. So I think I've said more than enough. So I will now try to say something formal and celebratory about this wonderful occasion. As I do not go to very many book launches, I'm very pleased and proud to be at this book launch. It was lovely to work with Lucy. We had our moments, I think it's fair to say. But we got through those moments, and I'm very, very honoured and very, very proud to be here today. And I wish and I hope that this book, that the 1778 downloads is just the start. And I wish this book had extraordinarily well, and I wish you all well. And congratulations to all of you and to Lucy, but to all of you for producing such a wonderful, wonderful and important book. And on that note, I will give way to someone else. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brendan, for that lovely launch. Lovely way of putting it. Yeah, I'm delighted that it's part of a series. I think it gives it it gives it a context. But I'm also aware. I'm delighted that it's a collaborative project, because really both Kent and myself have associated the words cooperation, which is close to collaboration, and compassion as essential elements of survivability. So Jason has had to leave, and I'm sure you join me in thanking him for giving such a great, concise presentation. I'm now going to talk very briefly myself. Oh, it feels a bit odd, me stepping in here. I'm inclined to step aside and let Ruth go ahead, and then I might just take the final slot. I feel that would be fairer than me talking 2 or 3 times. So I'm going to hand over at this point to Ruth. And Ruth, if you could just say, with everybody else, just a 3 or 4 minute introduction to your work in general, and to give a context within which you wrote this chapter.
Right. Well, very briefly, so I'm Ruth Irwin. I live in New Zealand, and I'm coming to speak to you from the Manukau Harbour and the Waitakere Mountains. And I guess I raised that because in our culture, we do a pepeha, which is to say where we're from. So I've grown up in these mountains, and it's very, very nice to be home after 10 years. I really am appreciating being back in my own environment and my own culture. It's lovely. Having said that, I've been overseas for quite a number of years. It's been very interesting and dynamic. So I was working in Fiji for a while, Scotland for a while, Australia for a while. So it's been about 10 years since I've lived here in New Zealand. I'm just embarking on a new project, which is working with Māori on climate change and resilience. So looking at communities and how communities can adapt to the problems that we're facing here in New Zealand, which is, we're getting huge storms now. So lots of soil runoff, food security problems, and freshwater problems. So the work that I'm doing is both deeply philosophical and deeply practical. So I really appreciate, Lucy, your very practical approach, because to me, I think philosophy went down a dead-end route for a number of, I'd say, centuries, which was a very abstract, notion that philosophy should be heading towards the abstract. Thank you very much, Immanuel Kant. And I think it's very refreshing and very, very important to be coming back to a sort of more practical orientation, a planetary orientation towards philosophy, policy, culture, and practice. So that's me. Thanks.
That's wonderful. Kent, would you like to say just a few words about your work and perhaps where you are? Thank you.
Sure. And thanks very much to you, Lucy, for initiating this project and seeing it through to the end. I've edited or co-edited a few books myself, and the metaphor of herding kittens comes to mind. It's just a lot of work, and you've got to see it through to the end. And thank you for doing that. So anyway, very briefly, I'm Canadian. I did my PhD in the University of Toronto on philosophy of physics. I'm very interested in Bell's theorem and things like that. Don't get me started on that. And but I'm also extremely interested in ecological questions and climate, and the notion of symbiosis, which I think is very important. And my interests in theoretical physics have a parallel to my interest in ecological problems, because in both cases you have a really interesting tension between kind of holistic global perspectives versus local particular sort of additive perspectives, and there's a lot to be said about that. So Well, and currently I'm working on a large project to understand sustainability in terms of symbiosis. And and actually my paper in the book talks about that a little bit, at least in broad outline. But maybe I better stop there and then win it. And but because otherwise you'll never stop me. And
Richard, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Richard Page. I've been privileged to be an assistant in writing most of Carl Anthony's books and Dr. Paloma Pavel's books. I might at the outset take a note from Jason about Thomas Berry. Dr. Paloma Pavel and Carl Anthony are the current holders of the Thomas Berry Award from the Yale Environmental Forum. So I'd like to quote one of Thomas Berry's most famous sayings is that we are not a collection of objects, but a communion of subjects. For my part, I heard Terry Tempest Williams yesterday tell us that the future of our species will not be determined by the facts, but by our heart's common love and loss. Carl Anthony, an amazing African American, started out in the bottoms of Philadelphia. That's the wet area reserved for people of color, and raised himself from his father's expectation of being a woodworker to becoming one of the major contributors to funding of environmental projects and environmental justice projects in the world. He's an architect, Columbia trained, urban, suburban, regional design strategist, served as acting director of the Ford Foundation's worldwide programs in environment and development. Carl funded the Conversation on Regional Equity Core, a dialogue of national policy analysts and advocates for new metropolitan racial justice strategies. He was founder and for 12 years executive director of the Urban Habitat Program. After he found out that environmental organizations, he was then the director of Earth Island Institute at the instigation of David Brower, founder of the Sierra Club. And he found that white environmental organizations were more interested in polar bears than people. So he founded Urban Habitat, which is on the ground seeking of environmental justice for all. And with Luke Cole, he founded and published the Race, Poverty, and Environmental Journal, the only environmental justice periodical in the United States. I'm very proud to know him and to help in his writing. He's blind and not able to read his own work, so later I'll read a portion of it. I'd like to thank you very much for allowing me to be here.
Thank you very much indeed, Richard. That was a lovely introduction, and thank you for giving us an introduction to Carl as well. That's very concise, and you know, he has had a remarkable life, no doubt. So now we're going to move on to Cara. Are we moving on to you?
Okay, Lucy, thank you so much. And Brendan, I'm delighted that you are also able to join us today and that Paloma and Carl were able to jump into this project. It's also a thrill to be collaborating with all of you. I am a former university professor of critical pedagogy. My doctoral work was in continental philosophy with the European Graduate School, and I have left academia for the most part. I'm in my school bus right now, converted eco-art installation school bus, where I conduct climate justice performances and play with this constant trickstering with the private in relation to the public, the personal in relation to the public, the personal in relation to the political, and what does it mean to embody our practice in terms of ancestral technologies. Lucy, you use the term tapestry, that this book is a tapestry. The idea that techne, the root of technology, is to weave. So my life as a mother, as an activist, educator, performer, is all about the anguish and the exquisite rapture, the euphoria of weaving our ancestral technologies, our ancient wisdoms, to address the horrors in which we are complicit, that internalized fascism. And how do we do that with a sense of grace, using our somatic intelligence, our spiritual intelligence? Paloma and Carl awarded me the Random Kindness Community Leadership Award a few years ago. That was also awarded to Vandana Shiva and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And I think their choice to include me was very much rooted in my commitment to these embodied practices. And I am delighted to be working with all of you as we play, hopefully, a sense of play with theory as it co-evolve, as we co-evolve through our action and curiosity without necessarily having to arrive at solutions, because those are often, as we know, so very much rooted in the very hegemonies, the homogeneous hegemonies that we're trying to overturn. But what is it to be in such radical self-inquiry as we trickster collaboratively? I'll add that, collaboratively. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Cara. A lovely introduction. Yeah, full of thoughts and images as an artist. I'm not sure if you mentioned that you're also an artist and photographer. So next, I'm going to ask Paloma to say just a very few words, if we can keep it quite brief, because we've still got to do our presentations. So Paloma, if you could, I can't actually see. Oh, there you are. Brilliant. I'll hand over to you. Thank you, Paloma.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you to our distinguished gathering here of authors and community of practice. And also I want to thank our publisher for being here as well. And my own roots, I'm here speaking from Ohlone territory in Oakland, California, here in the San Francisco Bay Area today. And my ethnic and roots of birth go back to Southern California, where crossing the border, La Frontera, with Mexico deeply influenced my beginnings, as well as time in my grandmother's garden, where I felt her presence communicating the interconnectedness of all life and the seeds that are really our great wealth, and the diversity of seeds. And from that early beginning, I went on to other more formal education, including Harvard and the London School of Economics, as well as my learning as a wilderness guide and as a weaver on the coast of Maine, where I built the first deep ecology leadership center. And more recently, I am back in California, my place of roots, where I worked with Carl for the last 30 years, creating a intergenerational leadership center focused on bringing multicultural, multiracial voices into the environmental justice and climate justice movement. And we're very excited to see the cross-pollination going on between universities and formal educational systems and community-led expeditions of learning. So today we're hoping to share some of the panorama of that, of sort of the deep philosophical passion that has driven our work, and also the practical applications and inspiration from frontline communities on the ground. And what Carl, who is now blind but a visionary leader, continues to inspire our work, including one of our most recent projects, just to give a flavor of our work, which is working with the local Ohlone tribe in creating a haptic tour of a shell mound site. So a place where recent discoveries of ancient shell mounds have been devoted and dedicated to the learning and remembering and healing of our relationship to ourselves, to one another, in particular to Indigenous peoples of this land, and also to the greater world we share. And we are creating a haptic tour where one can both hear as well as feel that site. And I look forward to sharing some of the other creative edges that are emerging at this time of climate crisis and opportunity.
Thank you very much indeed, Paloma. Fantastic. It's really fascinating how much you and Carl have done in communities, and hopefully we'll have some time to discuss how that might be replicated, or how people might understand it and create their own niches or constructions or creations in different contexts. So that's fantastic. Thank you very much. So now, Robin, if you would like to say a few words just about your own work and background before we come to the presentations. Thank you very much, Robin.
Good. Can everyone hear me? That's great. So I'm Robin Attfield, and I have been a professor of philosophy at Cardiff University. I started there as far back as 1968 and retired in 2009. In between, I was teaching ethics, philosophy of religion, environmental ethics when it got started, because it didn't exist when I was first employed, and history of ideas. So I worked for Cardiff University full-time for 43 or so years, and went on supervising people a bit longer. But in due course, I retired in 2009, and I've written nearly as many books since I retired as previously, happily. I got started on environmental ethics back in the 1980s, and published a book called The Ethics of Environmental Concern, which was not the first, but approximately the second monograph in the field. I'll mention the one that preceded it by John Passmore in a moment. I got to know Lucy to some extent through correspondence. I don't know quite how it started, but we corresponded during the duration of Lucy's doctorate. In a way, the book that I've written, which has most to do with the themes that have been ventilated already, is a book not yet published called The Ethics of the Climate Crisis, and is coming out from Polity Press next April. But what we're here for is our own contributions to Lucy's book. And so I should say a little bit about the subject of stewardship, which I will return to later. Now, John Passmore, he was a very fine scholar, wrote a book called Man's Responsibility for Nature, which was first published in 1974, just at the very start of environmental philosophy and environmental ethics. And he rightly held that human beings have mostly held a despotic attitude to the natural world. But he, looking back at the ancient world, he asked himself whether there were any signs of a more enlightened attitude. And one of the traditions that he elicited was the tradition of stewardship. and he found some of the pre-Christian philosophers adopting that position. He didn't really notice that there was a great deal of it among the early Christians, but he found it being revived in the early modern period, and that I think he made a great contribution. Did John? I met him at a conference or two, but I think he underestimated stewardship. And one source of his, Clarence Glacken, actually showed how there was very much more concern for a responsible attitude with humans recognizing their answerability within the early centuries of the Christian Church, and also among Jews and Muslims also. And what I'm doing in my chapter is expounding ways in which we could develop the stewardship approach and defending it against criticisms, because on the whole, whereas the charities and the public like it, the philosophers don't. So I will return to that when I make my contribution later. I think that's enough for now.
That's perfect, Robin. Thank you very much indeed. Good. Well, I will say a brief word about myself. I did my PhD in as a result of seeing a community on the west of Ireland suffering from fragmentation, while the land was already suffering from fragmentation. So I made the connection between the community and the land, really, and decided to look into how, first of all, I looked at a book called Respect for Nature, which was by Paul Taylor, and I did some research on whether or not you could expand a biocentric ethic. And I looked then at systems, and I became more interested in systems theory. And then, very tragically, my supervisor died. So I changed supervisors, and that changed my approach dramatically, because my new supervisor was Professor Graham Parkes, whose specialization was Nietzsche and also Dogen, particularly Southeast Asian philosophies, but particularly Dogen's Shobogenso, which I read with difficulty. And I'm not sure quite how much I understood, but I did take a few ideas away. And it was really the practice, the idea of practice realization that became revelatory to me, because it made me realize that as soon as you realize what you're doing while you're doing it, you have the possibility of shifting your attitude to what's going on. So my philosophy became very colored by that approach. And I wrote a book on the basis of exploring an alternative to ethics, which I'm pretty sure we could discuss endlessly, and I have discussed in other contexts. There's quite a lot of controversy around the idea of, could you ever live a life without morals or without ethics, which doesn't mean that you live unethically or amorally. Anyway, I got into all that, and then this book came about, and I'm delighted that it did, and I've really enjoyed getting to know some of you and being part of this project. I, again, like Cara, am not working in academia. I would say another idea that I've got is that we don't have the kind of free will that we think that we have, that we are cause, effect, cause, effect, cause, effect, until we wake up and realize what's going on. And then we have the opportunity to shift slightly. So again, I was looking at that idea in terms of free will. I don't think I was free to take part in academia. I didn't have the opportunities for reasons which were largely beyond my control. So instead, I have had a very fortunate turn of events, and I now am able to spend time writing, meditating, doing yoga, and going and swimming in the sea. So I live in paradise. I live in the Canary Islands during the winter, and have a fantastic life here. So I'm extremely lucky. So that's where I come into this picture. And now I'm going to give people the opportunity to talk a bit about the different chapters of the book. But before I do so, I think I better read, because not everybody is here, I think I better just go very quickly through the introduction of the book and give you an idea of the shape of the book, how it's structured, and who else has contributed apart from the people who are here at the moment. To begin with, obviously, the first chapter was looking at the good of systems. And I talked about David Abrams' phrase. I talked about enmeshment. I've often used Timothy Morton's work on enmeshment to give myself a better understanding of how we understand things if we get into this idea of dissolving the ego. And it seemed quite logical for me to have Ruth's chapter next. So in a moment, I will ask Ruth to talk a little bit about her work. And then Kent Peacock wrote about We Are the Emergency, and I'll give him a chance to talk about that. Then we have Justice in the Ecological Emergency, Carl's chapter on the search for common good. And Paloma is going to talk after that about the practice of the breakthrough communities that she and Carl have been involved in. Philosophy as an ecological practice then brings in Jason's approach, allowing realization, again, this Soto Zen idea of practices that allow realization to come into being. These are reflected in his chapter. And then I wrote about hungry spirits. This idea has been widely shared by Gabor Mate, that we look at consumerism, consumption. Again, this was an idea that was presented by Timothy Morton. So I explore those ideas. And then we get to Kara's chapter, which is on industrial capitalism's Trojan horse and whether the environmentalism that's going on is actually meaningful. Then we look at perspectives from the more than human world, and Paco Calvo and Natalie Lawrence have written a very successful, a very widely sold book called Plantar Sapiens. I met Paco this last summer. So Paco and Natalie's chapter comes next. That's chapter 8. And then we have a chapter from Michaela Anzotegui. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, and Dr. Hector Ricardo Ferrari. Michaela is actually a professor now as well. And they wrote about post-speciesist epistemology in the age of the Anthropocene. Then I had a section on breaking through cultural boundaries, and this is where Paloma and Richard Page have written about their breakthrough compass, navigating the injustices of the ecological emergency. I then considered breaking through philosophical boundaries, and we come to Dr. Chaitanya Motipali's chapter on the capabilities approach, which is a focus on Martha Nussbaum's capabilities approach to see what implications flow from that. And finally, we get to Robin's chapter, which is on secular stewardship in the ecological emergency. So I'm going to invite people in that order to give a short presentation. Please see if you can keep it within 10 minutes. What I'd love people to do is not to interrupt while people are speaking, but to write down any questions that you have in the chat so that people can, so that if we have time, or in as much time as we have, we can discuss any questions that emerge after everybody has had a chance to present. So beginning with Ruth, I would like to invite you, Ruth, to give your presentation now, please.
Okay. So my work over the last few years, well, I guess over the last 20 years, has been really a critique, a philosophical critique of idealism, particularly Descartes and Kant and the separation of the subject from the object. And, you know, if we abandon that notion of the separation of the subject, you know, that is sort of starkly separated really in Descartes from the object, then what comes next? So my, hold on, what's that? Oh, there we go. Right. So the chapter that I wrote for this book was on whakapapa, feminism and physics. I really like the fact that it's got that lovely FFF sort of sound, and that the way you write it is completely different in all those three words, whakapapa, feminism and physics. So I'll start with whakapapa. Whakapapa is a Māori term, very important conceptual term, and it means that everything is related. It's a sort of a taxonomy of relationships. Often whakapapa is understood as genealogy. It's usually translated into English as genealogy, which is a very poor translation. And unfortunately, because it's been translated into English as genealogy, most people, including most Māori, understand it as a very, you know, that it's about your human ancestors. But whakapapa means much, much more than your human ancestors. It actually means all of the species, the rock, the strata, the ocean, the stars, the weather. So you will get whakapapa or genealogies of different elements. For example, te whakapapa o te wai means the genealogy of water, and water includes, you know, cloud, on land water, so lakes and rivers, and then it might also include underground water and evaporation. It's the whole cycle. It's a sort of a genealogy of the cycle of water. So here we have some images of where I'm from. So this is my pepeha. This is the Manukau Harbour, which is where I live. And these are some of the species that are surrounding me every day. And they are part of my whakapapa, and I am part of their whakapapa, according to this conceptual arrangement. Some of us have already mentioned what happened in 2023. This is just up the road from my house on the Pika Road. It's still, this happened in February 2023, and it is still like that. To get this road back, or to build a bridge to recover this road, which goes out to the west coast, is going to be very, very expensive. And New Zealand has had huge, huge storms. We've never had the extent of these storms before. When this collapsed, when this landslide happened, we had 80 mils of rain in a couple of hours, which is unheard of. 3 mils of rain is heavy rain, so 80 mils is just unheard of. So this is the kind of context that we are experiencing. So coming back to the notion of whakapapa, there's another important concept in Māori which is called the hongi, and the hongi is usually understood as a greeting, and quite often it's a sort of almost a caricature. You'll see Māori pressing noses together, and what they're doing is sharing breath. And I wanted to think about whakapapa and the hongi, because when I'm standing on my deck looking over the Manukau Harbour, I'm actually, you know, breathing the Manukau in to my body, and I'm breathing my body out back into the Manukau. And this constant interaction of vapors, of atoms, and of molecules is actually something that we very rarely think about, but it is a sort of a physiological illustration, if you like, of how we are not segregated individual subjects. We are actually always in physical interaction with our environment. So now I'm going to get to the feminism part. I really love a couple of authors, Julia Kristeva who is from Belgium, although originally from Algiers, and Lucia Rigori. And both of them have written about the body and how the body has this constant intersection, interrelationship, fluidity between what is the eye and what is the surrounding ecosystem. And Christava has a really, really interesting point in a book that she wrote in 1982, where she suggests that this exchange of bodily fluids with the outside and the internalization of things like food and water is actually quite fraught, because it really jeopardizes our understanding of the self. And so we have this abject reaction to losing the molecules from the self as they become part of the environment. So here, I was having a look on the internet to find some really good images. Here we've got, this is, lovely snot, and you can see that it's pretty pukey, it's pretty revolting. And that whole revulsion is actually a sort of a psychological mode that we go into in order to reject the notion that we are not a self-sufficient subject. And so you might read, you can reread Descartes and go, well, his abjectness was just incredibly strong. And that's part of the reason why he was rejecting absolutely everything, even solid objects, because they were not part of his self. He was definitely going to reject that. So part of what Rigori, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but a part of what Rigori and Christava are talking about is the fact that irreducibly, we are always breathing in, breathing out the environment. We are always, drinking in, sweating out, peeing out, pooing out the environment. And this kind of entanglement is actually, it's non-negotiable, it's irreducible. So the next part of the chapter that I wrote is on physics. And I relied heavily on Karen Barad's amazing book from 2007, where she's talking about quantum physics. And she's really interested in how subatomic particles are entangled. So I'm ancient enough that when I went to school, we didn't do quantum physics. We did this kind of atomic physics. So I did physics all the way through school to the 7th form. And this is all about, the protons and the neutrons there in the middle, and the electrons in a sort of shell on the outside. This is the molecule of water. And this kind of diagram is a little bit it does, tends to be a sort of a reductive form of how the molecule actually works, because these shells are not as closely knit or as uniform as this suggests. The outer shell here is actually quite widely spaced from the nucleus, the proton and the neutron in the middle there. And then when we get into more than electrons, neutrons, and protons, then we get to something even more uncanny. So this is another illustration. Of course, we can't take photographs of atoms because they're far too small. So these are all illustrations of atoms. And this one is trying to show how these shells, those outer electron shells, are very interactive and very dynamic. With quantum physics, and I decided in the interests of brevity that I'm not going to get too detailed about what's going on with quantum physics, but what I did want to talk about is the fact that at a quantum level, at a very tiny, tiny, tiny level, what we have is tiny itsy parts of the atoms that are entangled with other atoms in the same way that you have with sort of conventional physics, Newtonian physics, with say the oxygen molecule, so the water molecule. But with quantum entanglement, the objects can be incredibly large. and they can actually transgress across different so-called objects. So you can have a quantum entanglement that actually goes from one side of the universe to the other side of the universe, and they are entangled. When we say entangled, what happens is they're in what's called a superposition or of virtual probability, and which means that these subatomic particles are actually spinning, but nobody quite knows, and they themselves don't know in which direction they're spinning. However, if one of them gets located on one side of the universe, the other entangled pair is also located at exactly the same moment. Now, this goes against all Newtonian physics, and indeed Einstein got his knickers in a twist about it because he thinks that things can't go faster than light. But it's not a matter of going faster than, it's actually one object. It's like if my finger gets pricked on the right-hand side, my entire body knows immediately that I've had an injury. I don't have to be sending signals all over the place. My whole body as one entity understands that. The same thing happens with quantum objects, which can be extremely large as well as extremely small. So this is an image of quantum interference, and this is again coming back to the notion of probability curves. So with quantum physics, you're not really talking about a fixed object, you're talking about a sort of a spectrum of probability. And quite often it's talked about actually in terms of statistics, statistical probability. So things are likely to happen, and there'll be a statistical curve, and where and when and what precisely is going on hasn't been decided yet. And it's not that we haven't figured it out, it's just in a state of unknownness. And a large portion, I would argue, of what's going on in the concept of time is this process of unknownness. So again, just to sort of recap what I've just been talking about in terms of whakapapa, feminism, and physics, all three of these very disparate discipline areas are really engaged with how interconnected everything is. So for Māori, using the concept of whakapapa, we are profoundly interconnected with the water, the rocks, the plants, the animal species, the insects, the atmosphere, the weather. We're profoundly part of that interconnected, I don't even want to call it environment, because environment sort of suggests that it's outside, that it's an envelope, but actually it's actually part of who we are. And the hongi shows us and reminds people every time they greet, every time you have a greeting, what you're doing is sharing your breath. And when you're sharing your breath like that, it's a sort of a very visceral way of imbibing the other and exbibing yourself to become otherness. So that's whakapapa. Feminism, this notion of the abject and the fluidity of the body and how we are constantly in exchange, physical exchange, in terms of what we imbibe and what we exhale or what we excrete. These are always irreducibly in relation as environment. We are environment. Environment is the self. And finally, quantum physics in particular is really, really interesting because it shows how different atoms can actually inhabit your body, and at the same time these quantum objects can be external and internal to the body at the same time, and that these probability virtual probability curves are sort of part of the makeup of the body, of the self, as well as, and at the same time as, part of the makeup of the entire universe. That's, of course, being very quick off the mark, and it would have to be going into a great deal more detail than that. So finally, I just wanted to finish off with this beautiful mat, which is part of the Pacific culture again, Māori culture again, and these kinds of weavings are very culturally significant. And I guess what I'm interested in here is that I think that as a subject position, each one of us is like one of the threads in this weaving. If you tug on just one of those threads, the entire fabric of that mat warps. it's, you know, each one of us actually interacts irreducibly with all the rest of us. And when I say us, I'm not just talking about the human us, I'm talking about the species, the plants, the animals, the insects, the rocks, the ocean, all the, you know, the genealogy, the whakapapa of the wai, water. So one tug, if you change your conceptual basis, just one person changes their conceptual basis about things like whether I am separate from the environment or whether I'm part of the environment, that completely changes the entire way in which the warp and weft of everything is laid out. So what that means is that profoundly, each one of us has a massive impact on everything. You know, it's actually quite a refreshing way to think about things. You know, there's a lot of enemy going on at the moment, a lot of suicide actually, especially amongst young people, where they feel very, people feel very dispirited about the fact that, you know, climate change and all these other systemic issues that we're having with ecology and so on is just so overwrought and overwhelming that it's very difficult to try and comprehend and try and cope with. And especially if you think that you're an individual, then you don't really matter whether you're here or not. You have to cope with that. You're not actually nothing. There's no sort of contribution that an individual can make to change, say, climate change. So I guess what I'm getting at is that this interconnection that comes out of whakapapa, feminism and physics makes it a very meaningful universe that we are part of. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. That was a beautiful introduction. I think we've got a few questions or a few comments already, and no doubt we will have some more, but we will need to keep very tight on time because already we've got Kent, Richard, Paloma, Cara, Robin, and myself. If we each had 10 minutes, then we would be well over time. So if we can keep it as short and as sweet as possible, that would be great. So now I'm going to invite Kent to give a presentation. Kent, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, I actually timed this, and it should be about 6 minutes as long as I don't distract myself too much. And yeah, the title of my paper was "We Are the Emergency," and I was drawing partially on remarks made by Bill Rees, Canadian ecologist, and this was also, of course, drafted in the middle of the COVID pandemic, and I guess the part of the point I was trying to make was that parasitical eruptions are actually not that unusual, either of viruses or humans. Anyway, I'll skip all of that and just get right to the bit that I wanted to read. So earlier in the paper, I raised the question of what special neurological adaptation or trick has given H. sapiens its edge in the competitive struggle. I'll take a cue from biophilosopher E.O. Wilson, who has described creativity as the unique and defining trait of our species. That's a quote. To be fair, other species with complex neurology certainly do demonstrate some degree of creative problem-solving ability. But in human beings, this trait has been amplified by natural selection to a unique degree, so much so that it is certainly one of our major survival traits, if not the trait that has enabled our present precarious dominance of the planetary ecosystem. I think we have to pay much more attention than we have to how creativity works and how it relates to other important human capacities that are also hyperdeveloped, such as language and prosociality. So 2 examples briefly will illustrate the evolutionary and ecological impact of creativity. First, let us consider the sewing needle. This device makes its earliest appearance in the artifacts of the Magdalenian peoples of Europe around 25,000 years ago. While humans and near-human hominids have been around for hundreds of thousands of years, before a certain point, none of them had the sewing needle. Then someone figured out how to craft sewing needles made out of slivers of bone with holes skillfully drilled in them to receive strips of leather or possibly gut. So paleoanthropologist Brian Fagan says, quote, "The humble needle ranks alongside the taming of fire as one of early humanity's most significant innovations." Now, why would that be? The sewing needle, used in combination with the burin, the stone utility knife of the Neolithic, allowed its users to make tailored clothing, an enormous survival advantage in the harsh subglacial climate of Ice Age southern Europe. With warm, better fitting clothing, the Cro-Magnons would have been able to live and hunt over a much wider range, and it was very likely one of several innovations that got them through that survival bottleneck. The second example of creativity in action is vaccination, also often involving the use of needles. Like the sewing needle, before a certain point in time, there was no such thing as vaccination, and yet it is one of the important factors that have enabled the human population growth spurt. The really interesting fact, both scientifically and philosophically, about innovations like the sewing needle and vaccination is that they are new things. Although their possibility is implicit in the rules of physics and biology, before a certain point in time they did not exist. Creative innovations like the sewing needle can therefore be compared to what happens in a video game when you beat a level and you get new weapons or lives. You not only get to stay in the game, but often you have new capabilities and thereby a better chance of getting through the next challenge. Within philosophy, unfortunately, creativity has been for the most part either taken for granted, ignored, or downplayed, with the exception of a few thinkers such as Bergson. And another thing I do in this article is discuss the role of philosophy itself in what Jason Wirth called the great work, if you like. Philosophy must become a much more explicitly creative activity. Analysis will always be one of its most powerful tools, but philosophy just can't be about analysis. Carpenters cut a lot of wood, but carpentry is not just about cutting wood, but about building things, and so too is philosophy. But philosophers as well must be aware of what I will call the politics of creativity. Creativity is a natural human capacity, like the capacities for language, athletics, musicality, or tool making. Give it an opportunity and it will flourish. Some societies are distinguished by their brilliant creativity. Other societies deliberately stamp it out. Think of ancient Athens compared to Sparta. It is not obvious to everyone that the untrammeled exercise of creativity is a good thing. Innovation is obviously a threat to vested interests. Witness the enormous opposition the oil industry has mounted against climate science. Timothy Flannery quotes a Canadian oil executive who in 2013 said, quote, "The greatest challenge to the fossil fuel sector was simply innovation itself." But a more subtle anti-innovation dynamic can take hold as well, especially in an ecologically stressed society approaching its end game. And this is what particularly worries me. In a time of crisis, the exercise of authority seems justified. The lifeboat may not stay afloat, or so it seems, without Captain Bligh in the stern, cutlass at hand. But the captain may come to perceive innovation as a threat to his own authority and privileged position. He may enjoy sitting in the stern, he gets the best view, and he will be the last one to go hungry. If the lifeboat makes it ashore, he becomes just an ordinary bloke. So if someone in the lifeboat thinks of a better way to catch fish or a quicker way to navigate to shore, he or she may end up as shark bait. Those in power come to identify their own interests with the interests of the body politic, l'état c'est moi. They will suppress the innovations that could get the society out of the lifeboat on the grounds that they are too dangerous, too destabilizing, and sometimes indeed they are. But the main reason the creative heretics are suppressed is because the captain does not want to resolve the emergency that justifies his power and privilege. Hence, and here I cite Naomi's Klein's important book on there's how people use emergencies as a justification for authoritarianism. Hence, creativity is more likely to be suppressed precisely at those times of crisis when it is the most needed. Go back to the Neolithic sewing needle again. Obviously, we know nothing about precisely who created it, but we can be sure that it must have been permissible for someone to wonder out loud whether it would have been possible to find a better way to fabricate garments than the methods that have been used for many generations. The technical solution followed, but the question had to come first. And it must have been socially and politically possible for someone to ask it. What questions, what obvious questions are we not asking now? A society like ours that genuinely needs innovation, fundamental innovation, must tolerate the asking of unaskable questions. And it is the part of the job of philosophers to make sure those questions get asked. Okay, I'll stop at that point.
Okay, Richard, I'm going to hand over to you straight away. Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you. I'll be reading about Chapter 4, Justice in the Ecological Emergency, The Search for the Common Good, written by Carl Anthony and a group of Gaia interns of the Gaia Leadership Academy who are rooted in racial and social justice and dedicated to growing the next generation of environmental leadership. One moment, please. Wilma, mute and shut off your sound.
I did.
This is from Carl Anthony. It's embarrassing to be a white man reporting on what in the environmental justice movement, their keyword as expressed by Professor Dana Alston in 1989 is "we speak for ourselves." And here I am speaking for Carl Anthony. Fortunately, I'm reading what he wrote. The year 2050 has become a benchmark for forecasts and warnings about the state of the global environment and economy and predictions of climate impacts on biodiversity, health, and well-being. Clearly, planet Earth is facing an ecological crisis. Meanwhile, the gap between rich and poor continues to widen, causing suffering and frustration. Could these difficult challenges be an opportunity to make fundamental changes in human behavior and government policies and steer a course toward justice, sustainability, and planetary health? The common good. The philosophical concept of the common good has deep roots in Greek, Roman, and Christian thought and appears in various forms, if not all, social value systems. The common good is achieved when members of a society work together to improve the well-being of all, balancing the rights of individuals to personal possessions and community resources against the needs of the disadvantaged and vulnerable. Most indigenous and tribal societies take the concept of common good to a deeper level, recognizing human interdependence with all forms of life, including animals, plants, land and water forms, and forces of nature, a way of thinking congruent with discoveries in contemporary environmental sciences. That justice and sustainability are rooted in commitment to the common good is largely marked by their absence in the foundational history of the global North. This history chronicles the accumulation of wealth by a few at the expense of the many, sacrificing human and other lives and jeopardizing future generations in the course of extracting wealth from nature. Expanding the environmental justice movement. By the late 1980s, with the introduction of equity or ethics as a key component in sustainability, the notion of a connection between exploitation of nature and exploitation of people had already begun to surface. Mainstream environmental organizations were coming under heavy criticism for the absence of people of color in membership, staffing, and leadership. My friend and mentor Carl Lynn, a landscape architect and peace activist who was volunteering at Earth Island Institute, introduced me to radical environmentalist David Brower, who had left the Sierra Club to found Friends of the Earth, then left Friends of the Earth to found Earth Island Institute. David invited me to join the Earth Island board, and I agreed on the condition that Earth Island would sponsor an organization that Carl and I had been envisioning. It would focus on urban issues that the environmental movement had been avoiding, and train people in disadvantaged communities to become environmental and social justice advocates. That was the start of the Urban Habitat Program, which is still active today. To succeed by 2050 in transitioning to net zero CO2 emissions and all the changes that will require, we need the talent and commitment of educated people of all races. Increasing the numbers of Black and other students of color in environmental fields will afford them to advocate for resolution of environmental issues that affect communities they know and love, and potentially entire cities and regions. Engaging in dialogue, shared study, and teamwork, they can transfer a greater understanding of racial and environmental justice to white students. In a new wave of activism, organizers in the environmental justice movement work to establish connections between protecting the planet and tackling issues of race and class. Communities marginalized by the impacts of racism often face disproportionate health and safety risks, such as damage from intense storms, poisoning from exposure to toxins, and unequal access to necessities like healthy food, air, and water. Environmental justice demands the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all, regardless of race, color, or income, in the creation, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, policies, and regulations. The environment impacts everything about our lives, including where we live, work, and learn, and what we choose to do with our bodies. Environmental justice is violated when specific populations are provided less protection from environmental dangers, or when specific land is targeted for construction of projects harmful to health, like gasoline pipelines or chemical plants. I will cut to Carl's conclusion. This expanded conception of the common good promises immense benefits for cities and societies as a whole. Commitment to the common good makes possible a future of economic prosperity and environmental health for all. By the year 2050, people of color should be well on their way to achieving equity and taking their rightful place as fully enfranchised citizens and members of the beloved community. Creating socially and economically viable solutions to the existential threats of climate chaos and racism will by no means be an easy task, but people of color, especially women and youth whose voices were silenced for so long, have unique skills and perspectives for addressing the difficult social and environmental issues that affect us all. Respectful dialogue, open-hearted listening, and serious consideration of innovations offered by diverse stakeholders will aid in crafting achievable solutions to the urgent challenges we face as a human family. We have one of the Gaia interns here in the audience, if Sasha is here, but I don't see that maybe she can speak for a moment. Sasha Gilmore, what did it mean to you to be a Gaia intern and your contributions to create this heartful chapter?
Very briefly, yes.
Yeah, I'll be very brief. Can you hear me?
Sasha?
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, sorry, I can't turn my video on, but just very briefly, it was amazing to work as a Gaia intern with both Paloma and Carl. I feel like I learned a lot just through their experiences and their journeys, and also helping write this book. A lot of research that went into it. It was an amazing experience. Also working alongside the other Gaia interns who weren't able to be here today. But it was also exciting to hear everyone kind of give a synopsis of each of their chapters, and I'm excited to read the book in full. But yeah, thank you for having me. I don't want to take up too much time. I know we're kind of on like a time crunch, but thank you.
Thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you very much, Sasha, for that feedback. And thank you very much, Richard, for presenting on behalf of Carl. I haven't seen Carl Carl come up yet on the screen. If obviously, if he is able to join us, then we would be very, we would certainly love to hear him. But for the moment, let's move on to Paloma and let Paloma have her her 10 minutes or tighter if possible, Paloma, to give your presentation. Obviously, if you need 10 minutes, have your 10 minutes. And thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you so much. I'm wondering also with our, I'm wondering about the ways in which people are learning alongside each other today. I realized that even as we prepared for this session, I found myself changing and transforming as I heard from New Zealand, from the United Kingdom, from the Canary Islands, from places and people who are here today. So I just want to thank everyone who's spoken so far. And I also am aware that there are people within us who are part of our communities and mentors who are speaking through us today. And I wanted to begin with a quote from one of mine, and en route to honoring a few of the others whose shoulders I'm standing on today in sharing this work. And I also want to honor especially my partner in this work, Carl Anthony, as well as one of my recent colleagues who was on the call earlier, Karen O'Brien from the University of Oslo and part of the UN IPCC team that's working in biodiversity, and hosted me recently as a climate justice Fulbright scholar there. So I want to say that we are here as flow-throughs, as living systems who, like trees, have the nutrients flowing through us, and that I'm thrilled to be offering those today. So in the spirit of that flow through, I want to offer these words from Desmond Tutu that open the chapter that we have offered called Breakthrough Compass, Navigating the Injustices of the Ecological Emergency. We'll be building on some of the common restoration of the commons that Carl and Richard have just shared in practical ways, and how we apply those. We are living in an historic moment, and we are each called to take part in a great transformation. Our survival as a species is threatened by global warming, economic meltdown, and an ever increasing gap between rich and poor. Yet these threats offer an opportunity to awaken as an interconnected and beloved community. Here in South Africa, interconnectedness is described by the concept Ubuntu. Ubuntu is the philosophy and belief that our humanity is inextricably bound up in one another, and any tear in the fabric of connection must be repaired for us all to be made whole. This interconnectedness is the very root of who we are. Thus, compassion and service to others enhances the humanity of all, including oneself. So I want to emphasize our devotion to this historic moment that we are living in, and also the ways in which we deeply interconnect and affect one another in this work. And I also wanted to invite us to take a moment to breathe together here, even in these Zoom places, to maybe take a moment to look outside if you are near a window or a green space, and to see how this language, these stories, this work is affecting you today as you're hearing it, and perhaps to share something that has touched you as you are receiving this deep offerings from those of us who are part of these chapters. So this circle is really central to who we are and this spirit of Ubuntu that I just described, and also to our practice, and really guides all the activity that we do. And we often ask ourselves, who is in the circle and who is outside the circle when we're involved in any particular practice or campaign related to climate justice work. And in placing this earth in the center of our circle, we're also asking ourselves, how is what we are doing here in our local neighborhood, in our campaign, whether it's the collapse of infrastructure due to climate acceleration and climate upheaval. I'm looking at, in my mind, at the road that we saw in New Zealand that occurred, collapsed after heavy rains were taking place. We also know about the islands that are going underwater. Here in our own Bay Area, there are changes happening where at high tides and at king tides, the water is going into the elementary schools here right in the Bay Area, and various roads are being covered and buried underwater. So we realize that we are one water, we are one air, we are one living system of Gaia, and that part of the illness and imbalance that we are overcoming is that sense of fragmentation within ourselves, between each other, and with our larger biosphere that holds us all. The work I'm sharing is my collaboration over the last 30 years with Carl Anthony, who is with us in his presence and in his spirit today. And the notion of this circle, I'd like to expand that briefly as it relates to this article. We start with the story of me. When we enter a community, it's often a place where one's voice is not wanted, where one's voice hasn't mattered. Places that have been dumping grounds, where toxic waste has been dumped, where disinvestment has occurred, where there is a sense of everything from poverty to racism, that this lack of even feeling that one can impact or influence the direction of policy is often at risk. So in the work that we do, we often begin with this very simple but powerful map of saying, what is precious to us, and what is our name? Where did our name come from? How did we come to be standing on the ground that we're on this day? And where have our peoples come from, whether they are indigenous to the places that we live in or have traveled as part of the rivers of immigration that are increasingly affecting the communities that we live in. So, and we have shared our histories, and in some cases unearthed long-held feuds between various community groups. And in the beginning, we often have to establish sort of terms of engagement that make it important that everyone matters. We have an expression which is, if you're not at the table, you're often on the menu in the climate decisions that are in the ecological emergencies that are going on. So how do we begin with finding a story of me and finding our place in that? And then we can expand from that to a story of we. Once we have found our voices and begun to share our stories, we want to find out what has affected our lives together. Community leaders often wake up to the connections between climate change and social equity in a way that feels empowering and relevant to them. When we often begin working on climate issues, we'll ask, what is the face of climate to you? And we'll see people drawing pictures of polar bears. And when we begin unearthing the reality of climate, which is often affects the bodies, the asthma, the ability to breathe, when communities begin to feel that, in fact, their very lives are interwoven with this larger body of Earth in ways that have direct impact, they then begin to feel that this is a fight that's also theirs. This is a struggle and an investment that, and I'm thinking in particular of a young man in West Oakland, Davila, who, when he found that his sister, who had gone to the hospital many times for emergencies due to asthma and pollution, came aboard this movement, he became an ambassador for climate change, and actually is now teaching, and turned his life around and actually saw himself as an important force for change. The 5 stages that we have learned by listening to community groups around the country are something that I'd like to just sort of give you a very brief picture of. We discovered in listening to communities who are working on climate that there's often a continuous process of learning that begins with waking up to something that is occurring. Sometimes it's a dumping or heavy or desertification or an imbalance within the ecological systems that are making it hard for life to even continue. Something that they find that they have to stand up and say no to. Following that stage of immediate campaign of against a particular destruction, it might be clear cutting that's going on, or other desecration that's occurring in there. Then a stage of stepping back and getting grounded often follows that. In that stage of getting grounded, it often is a point where people learn about the history of how did these decisions come to be made? How does public policy come about? Where do people find their policies affecting, so that the rules of the game are already established before they can even be at the table on decisions? The third stage of exploring new horizons is one where we found community groups thinking outside their box, outside of what has been known, oftentimes making coalitions with people that they haven't known before. In some cases, we've created education days where youth leaders like Sasha, who's with us today, meet with elected officials, with business leaders, and actually represent and move the issues that are on the table at any one given time, helping build across geographies and across intersecting areas of concern, until the group can actually reach a place of a yes. And in this case, we here have found that there's not only a kind of linear or step-by-step progression that occurs when community groups are living together, but there's also a kind of mythic aliveness that occurs, that there's something about we have a kind of background of stars here, feeling connected to a larger cosmos.
Sorry, Paloma, we're just looking at the time.
Thank you. Great.
you. If you
I'll wrap it up here.
please, thank
So reaching beyond a stage of sort of being on fire with an issue to one of getting grounded in the soil of one's roots, exploring new horizons of possibility, and then saying yes to a living possibility that goes across boundaries. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paloma. Wonderful, beautiful slides, wonderful. And I know that you were squeezing a lot into a very short time. Cara,
We will be kept
can you-
together. Thank you.
thank you so
briefly,
much.
Ruth, I'm so happy that you included Origere and Kristeva, specifically in the context of philosophical practices. I collaborated with each of them about 15 years ago with my photographs, and that work is actually fundamental to this chapter. And I will begin with the quote in the chapter from Vandana Shiva, who I have to share with delight that she just wrote the foreword to my new book. And she says, I think the big crisis of our times is that our minds have been manipulated to give power to illusions. And this goes back to what I was talking about before in terms of internalized fascism and radical self-accountability. Race, equality, and social ecology are inherently incompatible concepts. Our immigrant nation, following modern civilization, was founded on white supremacy, and today, ironically, is sustained through the bewitching lure of the charade of equality, itself founded in xenophobia. Racism is insidiously intertwined with the histories of transportation, urban planning, agriculture, education, and energy infrastructures since the founding of the United States. Orthodoxy of equality, the bedrock of democracy, has become a euphemism that perpetuates environmentally racist capitalism. Equality and its fallacious language of equity is the Trojan horse that ferries corporate capitalism into the mainstream. Disentangling the roots of systemic psychic, corporeal, and social violence, my chapter for our book today, titled Equality, Industrial Capitalism's Trojan Horse, Environmental Racism, Green Colonialism, and the Renewable Energies Revolution, explores the crucial distinctions between equality and equilibrium, access and freedom, privilege and justice. The reference point for equality, as manifested in the US, is not freedom, nor justice, nor power. The reference point is convenience, waste, culture, that reinforces racist power structures of big oil, big pharma, big ag, big banks, big tech, etc. While powerlessness is the problem, redistribution of power, as it is currently defined, is not the solution. Are we struggling for due process, or are we actually compounding our impotency and dependency on fallow normative hierarchies? I argue that equality and privilege offer counterfeit advantages rooted in Western imperialism, i.e. racism. So I'll speak about this in terms of greenwashing and the renewables, quote unquote, renewables revolution. By scrutinizing the relationships among unchallenged assumptions of how we, and I go through an analysis of who the we is, of how we are socialized, this project reconfigures how perception and choice frame freedom. Political and ethical analysis of the interstices of cultural studies and corporeal politics enable a rhizomatic reconceptualization of community rooted in difference and vulnerability. And this goes back, of course, to Origere and Kristeva, and also Karen Barad, who is one of the endorsers, along with Noam Chomsky, Paul Hawken, James E. Hansen, for Zazu Dreams. Laying the groundwork for an emancipatory performative pedagogy, I examine the lived intersections of race, ethnicity, health, the construction of health, and to economics. And we have to remember that the root of economics, oikos, the Greek oikos, is the same root as ecology, through the lens of unity and diversity, again, referring to the intersection of cultural diversity with biodiversity. In order to challenge the inertia that perpetuates insidious internalized oppression and convenience culture hegemonies inscribed in our current crisis of agency, I offer citizen subjects a constructive strategy to recognize our potential for transformative resistance. 7 years ago, I published my first transdisciplinary feminist philosophy book, Viscous Expectations, Justice, Vulnerability, the Obscene, exploring the vulnerability of the body as a strategy for collaborative justice, rooted in the fundamentals of, for example, Murray Bookchin's social ecology. It scrutinizes how racial hygiene and anti-intellectualism and ethnocentrism configure the troubled yet vital concept of equality. Today, the fictions that divide us and distort our histories are more virulent than ever. And of course, Israel, Palestine, Gaza is an excruciating example of those fictitious histories. Then I move on into looking at the construction of race, big pharma's coercion and the illusion of consent, whitewashing in eco-villages, and underlying these intersectionalities is greenwashing, the falsehoods of renewables in the renewable energies movement through the lens of green colonialism and quote unquote clean tech industries. And then I offer a response to these interconnected hegemonies with bioregional learning centers, social permaculture, and examples such as my home, the Love Bus, and I can perhaps dig up some images to show you, and Soul, my concept, eco-action concept, shared opportunity used local, which reflects the commons and an intersection of individual behavior, corporate accountability, community action, policy reform in relation to infrastructural redesign. So those 5 simultaneous roots that then can generate a supply chain consciousness in which the embodied energy of an object is no longer invisible, but integral to our somatic understanding of what it means to be participating in 2024 in these, again, in our internalized fascism, in these worlds of consumer waste society. And I include, is part of my conclusion, the various indigenous perspectives to help guide and transform both science. I give examples with Rachel Carson, Einstein, and Hawking, and politics, examples of ancient technologies, for example, the Marsh Arabs, the Iraqi Marsh Arabs, their use of engineering as models, and ancestral wisdoms. And as Paloma explored Ubuntu, the Shou people, and I conclude with examples of the Zohar in relation to the Mayan concept, you are the other me, Enlek Ek. Again, in conjunction with Thomas Berry's Ecozoic, Audre Lorde's Erotic Politics, the Quechua Sumac Kusai's Buen Vivir, and as Ruth beautifully explored, the Wakapapa. And my new book coming out with Vernon Press, The Alchemy of Intimacy, Unlearning What We Think We Know, is exploring, again, these mind-body intimacies, these interspecies intimacies through a series of conversations about radical self-accountability in addressing climate chaos.
Okay. Robin, I'm going to hand over to you and let you give your presentation. Thank you very much for coming along as well.
Thank you, Lucy. This extract from my chapter is part of a defense of stewardship of a secular kind. I now turn to a key objection to stewardship understood on a secular basis, namely that secular stewardship is meaningless either because of an absence of answerability when answerability to God is no longer in question, or else because of the limits of human capacities. Here, Jennifer Welchman replies well to the part about answerability, since current agents can instead be answerable to the moral community of contemporaries and to their immediate successors, as I too have argued. But very little is said by her, that is by Jennifer, in reply to the remarks of Stephen Jay Gould and of James Lovelock about human capacities. Gould and Lovelock both regard the idea of managing nature as ridiculous, and Gould regards it as embodying arrogance, adding that on geological scales we are virtually powerless. To this, Bruce Reichenbach and Elving Anderson aptly reply that the very arrival of humanity on the scene, and thus of human-generated disruption, is what makes stewardship both possible and necessary. They say this in theistic language, but the reply is just as relevant as a defense of secular stewardship. What stewardships are capable of doing is mitigating the human footprint and ameliorating its ecological impacts. The indispensability of stewardship shows that far from its practice forming arrogance, its non-practice amounts to negligence. Lovelock supposes that stewardship, like most science, embodies what he calls reductionism, that disregards the self-regulation that may already be exercised by the superorganism Gaia. He also appears to assume that environmental stewards would rapidly reach out for geoengineering solutions to greenhouse gas concentrations, such as saturating the ocean with iron chloride, Lovelock 2006. But this is his phrase, gunboat diplomacy approach, strongly conflicts with recognizing the precautionary principle, which environmental stewards are both free and prone to favor, and conveys that Lovelock confuses stewardship and Promethean neocolonialism. Furthermore, whether or not our planetary systems are in some way self-regulating, they're unlikely of themselves to curtail anthropogenic climate change or rapid species loss. Perhaps this is why Lovelock goes on to advocate seeing ourselves as planetary physicians instead of stewards. But if his misunderstanding about reductionism and arrogance are set aside, there is no reason why we should not see ourselves as both planetary physicians and stewards. To return to Palmer's, that is Claire Palmer's claim that stewardship is unecological. Her claim that the idea of universal management is nonsense is well taken. But Palmer's conclusion can still be questioned. Here it is, quote from Claire Palmer. Stewardship is inappropriate for some of the planet some of the time. Some of it for all the time, the deep oceans, and all of it for some of the time, that is, before humanity evolved and after its extinction. Yet, for one thing, stewardship is not synonymous with interventionism and is compatible with letting be, for example, in Antarctica. There again, granted that there was no human responsibility before there were human beings, and there will be none in terms of new human actions after human extinction, responsibility remains possible, human responsibility remains possible for the entire sphere of nature that humans can affect, and not only for the sphere of human settlement or appropriation. And in the 21st century, this includes, for better or for worse, the deep oceans, the solar system, and much of outer space beyond it. Unless this extensive power is exercised with responsibility, global problems will be intensified. Thus, the choices between power exercised responsibly and power exercised without responsibility. So, far from evolutionary theory making stewardship obsolete, 20th and 21st century science and technology actually make an attitude akin to stewardship indispensable, particularly in fields such as climate change mitigation and curtailing biodiversity loss. Now, the remarks of Lovelock appear to assume that stewardship and management are synonymous. However, recognition that stewardship need not be anthropocentric serves to reduce the cogency of this assumption. For management is usually anthropocentric, even if it is not always such. Besides, stewardship, even when it really is anthropocentric, is prone to take into account the foreseeable interests of future generations far more than management normally does. Also, it is capable of taking into account the good of non-human species and of ecosystems to a much greater extent than management can. For management is normally responsible to shareholders, or else to public corporations whose performance is regarded as answerable to voters. And many shareholders and most voters are prone to a short-term understanding of the performance of companies or institutions. When, by contrast, stewards regard themselves as answerable to the moral community, they are free to take into account a much broader range of interests, future generations, and non-human creatures included. This contrast, indeed, allows us to make sense of remarks of people such as Young-Ho Soo, who express a contrary assumption to that of Lovelock. Thus, Soo asserts, in a context about moving from a market-based approach to non-market social gains, quote, "In more general terms, a paradigm shift in policy making from environmental managerialism to environmental stewardship is required." Soo, 2014. When we grasp this contrast, and also accept that stewardship can take the form of letting be, as in the preservation of forests, wetlands, and peat bogs, and the establishment of maritime reserves, the tendency to suppose that secular environmental stewardship lacks answerability, or that it is just as detrimental and just as implausible as universal management, dwindles towards zero. Accordingly, this objection against secular stewardship fails, both when it alleges that secular stewards lack answerability, and when it claims that stewardship far exceeds human powers. Obviously, there is no scope for stewardship of those tracts of the universe that human behavior cannot significantly affect, such as galaxies other than our own. But the situation is quite different with our own planet. As Welchman conveys, secular stewardship is far from an impossible task. And this conclusion stands despite the attempts of Gould and of Lovelock to make attempting it appear ridiculous. Soo has more recently presented examples of forms such as permaculture that it might cogently take, the same 2014 article. While De Paula has suggested that it might take the form and exhibit the virtues of gardening, De Paula, 2013. These are both compatible with it sometimes taking the form of letting be, relevant to forests and oceans and to Antarctica alike. I rest my case.
Robin, thank you so much. Thank you. Yes, I listened to De Paula talking about gardening in Sicily, where he lives. It was very interesting. Now, I am going to read one paragraph from the final chapter of the book, and then I'm going to invite people once again to ask any questions that they might want to ask, bearing in mind that we probably have time for one question, and then we can perhaps go back to Cara and just have a quick look at her home. So all I want to do is read one paragraph. If you want to hear more about what I think and my work, then you can buy the book and read it. I'm just going to take a paragraph from the final from the final chapter, which I called "Learning to Live, Learning to Die," which was almost stolen almost completely from Robert Bringhurst and Jan Zwicky's brilliant book, Learning to Die, which is about how we respond to the ecological emergency. I just want to read this half paragraph. The range of approaches taken in this volume to the challenges that the ecological emergency brings to our critical and urgent attention offer a wide variety of interpretations of this theme, as you've just heard. But they all point, this is possibly slightly controversial, they all point in one way or another to the manner of our engagement, the way we talk about our experience, and who or what we include in considering where our relationships begin and end. The determination to practice philosophy as a way of being with integrity, a way of thinking that is unafraid of challenge, but that nevertheless takes the backward step to clear space, is essential to how we respond to what is emerging in and around us. And I'll finish by saying very briefly what I didn't say in the book, which is that one could say that what we're going through is analogous to being on the Titanic. And do you want to be on that sinking ship with people who are panicking or in despair or despondent or angry and violent? Or do you want to be with people who are looking after their capacity for calm and resilience so that we can properly serve one another when it's really needed? So that's the kind of ethos which has emerged from the book. So now I would like to invite anybody else who, I'm looking through the questions. I don't see any particular question. If anybody has a question, Dr. Paloma Pavel.
Just as we go through questions, do you mind if I put up a share screen and image that refers to what you were just, and an illustration of the chapter that, or the paragraph that you just read?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
But please go on with the questioning. I'll just get the image up.
But bear in mind that we will finish in the next 5 minutes, and I want to use this this opportunity to thank everybody who has come, made the effort to come together like this. It's I have to salute Cara for the initiative, and thank you very much for taking the initiative on this, and thank you everybody else who's come along to this. I think Kent has said that his son is able to do some editing. So hopefully we can put something together that we can put up, either in sections or as a longer introductory video that people can watch on YouTube. So if everybody is happy enough for that to happen, I think that would be a great way of showcasing the book. So now, Cara, I'm going to, just for the last few minutes, hand over to you and let you talk about this illustration. Thank you.
Okay, well, the illustration, and then I put in the chat, we recently did a film on our home, The Love Bus, addressing beauty and waste. So that link is in the chat if people are interested, and I would love for feedback. This illustration, in reference, Lucy, to what you were just sharing, rather than being overwhelmed with climate grief, climate anxiety, what is now being termed ecological distress when it's coming in terms of masses of people, what if we were to see these interlocking forms of oppression, climate chaos, as a path towards the interlocking emancipations, so that as each of us have said, our interconnectedness can become a bridge for working together. And what if we raised our children differently? What if we could focus on our epigenetic potential to co-evolve in an entirely different framework from the familiar, from our habituated obedience? And that's what this image is inferring, or hopefully igniting.
Wonderful. Beautiful image, requires a lot of reflection, and shows that, you know, as I said in quoting that chapter, that paragraph, that, you know, I think a multiplicity of responses is important. I think there isn't a one size fits all. It's a hugely complex, nuanced, interconnected subject that is emerging for us, and we need to realize that there's no ideal solution either, that solutions are context dependent, and that systems are always in process, and therefore you're never going to get to a stage where, you know, you've reached utopia. So I think this is part of this emergence, is this realization that we, you know, that there is no, we're not looking for an ideal state, but I think that we can have approaches that include stewardship. We can have approaches that include a recognition of our interconnectedness, and that those don't need to contradict each other. I think that's why, for me, this book is important, because it shows that a range of approaches is worth thinking about. Now, I will close the meeting. I see that Kent has to go anyway in a minute. So all I want to do is thank you once again, all of you, for being here, for coming. Maybe we can leave with the question that Paloma has put in the chat. What gives you hope in this moment of the ecological emergency? And perhaps that's something that we can leave you to think about, anyone who participated in this meeting. But for now, I'd like to thank you all. I'd like you all to go out with the book. I've circulated a code which gives a discount for the book, so I can circulate that again. If you want to connect with any of us, then please feel free to do so. You can do so by going to the Springer page for philosophy as practice in the ecological emergency. I'll put a link now in the chat so that you can find the book there. And I hope that you will share the message of the book and get as many copies of it out there to as many people as possible. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Okay.